My name is Elizabeth Cruse. I'm a board certified internist, and I'm a primary care physician. And Jean, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, you got the next slide coming for us? I'm Jean Abbott. I'm a retired emergency medicine doc, working these days at the intersection of palliative care, hospice, and ethics. And I'm on the ethics committee at Boulder Community and also at True Hospice and University Hospital. So next slide, I think, Elizabeth, was that, and then you can continue. So we have several goals for this session, recognizing how key it is to have somebody to speak for you, thinking about the documents, considering why the documents aren't enough, and then also understanding where you can go to get some more help and information. So we're still 2 years into this pandemic, Elizabeth, and we're all still learning Zoom a little bit better. But please, the reminder, just as Amy said, to go ahead and type questions into the chat and they'll get consolidated and hopefully we'll get a chance to answer as many as possible. Well, I think we're not doing very well, Elizabeth. Not a lot of progress. And in fact, I guess some days I think that we've complexified things an awful lot. But this is from The Onion, one of my favorite journals. And here we are with all of us being mortal. So what's interesting over the last few decades is that the trajectory for how we die is very varied. We all, or many of us, sort of say, gosh, I wish I would just wake up dead someday. I know my mother-in-law stated that quite emphatically multiple times, but sudden death actually only occurs about 10% of the time these days. The other three trajectories occur maybe 30, 30, 30, about equally. The second graph that you see, the terminal disease graph, is actually the trajectory that has brought us the hospice benefit. For people with terminal end-stage cancer, the trajectory of 6 months is a fairly predictable one. But there are two other important trajectories. Elizabeth, tell us about them, because I know you see them at the bedside and in the clinic.
Yeah, I would say, Jean, this is really what we see more frequently, sort of this stepwise, things just getting a little bit worse every time somebody is either has a downturn in their health or ends up in the hospital or something like that. Or in that frailty slide, there's this slow, steady decline over time. And I would say in my experience, those are much more common trajectories and really what's probably going to happen for most of us.
And I think the organ failure could be chronic lung disease, heart failure, liver failure, kidney failure, all of those different organ failures that are so common. And in fact, you were pointing out to me as we were having a conversation about this, that actually the time when we aren't able to rescue somebody from that downturn is actually sometimes very surprising to families, I think.
Yeah, I think when you've been many people, they have been rescued several times and they just don't think that there will be a next time that they don't get better. And that is surprising sometimes to families and to patients.
So one of the things that I think we want to try to convince you tonight is that planning ahead is really, really important. And part of the reason for that is that what you and I consider an acceptable life varies greatly. This is a really interesting study that came up a few years ago, and The Economist of all journals picked it up. And it asked, in the study, they asked 180 people who were in the hospital with a significant illness and were over 60 and had significant disease. And they said to them, tell us, what would be worse than death? what would be better than death. And it's a little tricky slide, but you'll see the black line down the middle. And things to the left of that are the percentage of people who said, for instance, bowel and bladder incontinence would be worse than death for me. And that's over half of people. So there are different kinds of disabilities. If you were confused all the time, about half of people say that would be worse than death, and the other half say, well, that might be acceptable. If you were living in a nursing home, 30% of people said, no, that would be worse than death, and the others said that that would probably be acceptable. And I think the point that I get out of this slide, Elizabeth, is just that we are a very diverse society, and what we consider an acceptable life, it varies a whole lot between people.
Definitely does.
So you've been on the front lines with COVID, perhaps a little more than I have. What lessons have we learned in the era of COVID? Because I think that's been a really interesting time to think about end-of-life choices.
I certainly have had many more people come to me at much younger ages asking me about end-of-life decision-making and paperwork. I think, personally, what I think and what I've seen in my practice is that what's happened with COVID is it became much more apparent to people that, you know, even though they thought they were in fairly good health, something could take them away very quickly from their family and without even having the chance to talk to their family or their healthcare provider about what's important to them, and that it could really happen at any age. And really healthy, we saw that, you know, who we would consider younger, healthier people were and still are dying of this infection. So I think it just became people's mortality became much more apparent to them. So COVID-19 really made these discussions more real, really made it seem like it was more possible to happen to you, and really made it more easier, I think, for people to start talking, unfortunately, to start talking about these issues. And I don't know if you saw the same thing.
Yeah, one of the interesting things was I think it actually helped providers also become a little more comfortable with having these conversations. So we all are learning to practice on a very concrete potential situation of a respiratory failure, death in the ICU. There are stories of people who've changed both ways. In other words, they've said, you know, I've had a full life. I wouldn't want to be on the ventilator. I don't want to die in the ICU. And so they can articulate a very concrete thing that they don't desire. And I've had other people say, wait a minute, I'm not ready to go. I may have cancer. I may only have a few years, but don't count me out. I'm willing to give aggressive treatment a go in the face of COVID. And so it's really opened up the conversation, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think so too.
So that's a little philosophy, but now let's look at a few nuts and bolts in terms of planning for the future and thinking about some of the steps that all of us need to be taking as we think ahead towards the arc of the end of our life. So you've got a great website, Elizabeth. Tell us a little about it.
Yeah, so this is a great source of information on bouldercommunityhealth.org or bch.org. There's a page called Advanced Care Planning. Actually, you can see here there's a lot of information there. There's even a great short video about how to fill out a medical power of attorney, in addition to a lot of other information. And really, I would say, Jean, you did a lot of work in helping to put together this website, I believe, and I know a lot of the people who did it.
Amanda Meyer, our lead for the Conversation Project in Boulder County, she got together with the palliative care people at BCH, and I think they did a fantastic job. There are a lot of forms there, and there's a lot of those little videos, Elizabeth, as you say, to help people through the various steps. So The first question, next slide for you, is Elizabeth. Who is your spokesperson if you can't speak for yourself? So, you would think of this as something for old people like me, but what if you ski into a tree or bounce off your mountain bike or have a stroke or some kind of serious infection where you're not thinking right? Who's going to speak for you?
Well, and I'll confess to everybody here that I was one of those people that didn't fill this out until very recently, even though I talk to people about this every day. So that's my confession for today. But so personally, for me, it's my spouse, my husband. He would be the one who would speak for me, and he's the person I've talked to. He knows what's important to me in life and what makes my life worth living. So how about you, Jean? Who would speak for you if you couldn't speak for yourself?
Well, I'm a generation older than you. So my husband's 75 and he's in good health. But when I think about it, I think I got to have some backups that are of a different generation. And I think we all need to think about that as we're getting older. So I have two kids. One of them is a very left-brained, solid person, and she would have no problems pulling the plug if that's what she thought I would want. And I have an artistic son who would have a lot harder time making decisions like that. Not that I haven't told him that he needs to support his sister, but different folks react differently to this. And I think we have a fun video right now to try to teach some of you the kinds of people you might want or you might not want to be making decisions for you. Let's hit it, Elizabeth.
Right, let's see how this goes.
Yeah.
Be your healthcare proxy? Like if you need someone to tell the doctor what to? I just go with whatever the doctors say. I wouldn't want to bother them. They're so busy. Doctors know best, right?
Be your healthcare proxy? Sure, I'd be happy to if I'm in town. Check out my Instagram pics from Peru. Wish you were here.
Oh, I could never let you go. I can't even throw a plant away. As long as it's got one little green leaf. I'd be like, can't we upload her to the cloud?
Well, heck yeah! I've given this a lot of thought. Let me tell you what decisions you're best off going with. You never let them resuscitate you. And if they even try to hook you up to one of those breathing machines, never! I got this! I totally got this!
How can you even talk about this? I can't, okay? I just can't. Mom, it's not like you're gonna die. No, I can't talk right now.
Oh wait, did I show you that meme from iFunny? The cat and the dishwasher? Oh my gosh, okay. So the cat's like, bleh. And then he's like, wah! Oh wait, sorry, what?
Well, hon, you and I have been through so much together. Here's what we'll do. We'll sit down, we'll get a cup of coffee, and you tell me what matters to you.
Well, it wouldn't be easy. I mean, I'd be sad, but I'd have your back.
I remember when we went through this with Mom, we really spoke for her. So I think I can do that for you. Let's talk about what you would want.
Well, there's certainly a variety of people that we all have, I think, Elizabeth. And there's some good lessons in that one. On the BCH website.
Sorry, there you go.
There you go. Is a tool that I found very useful on the Bar Association, from the Bar Association, that thinks about a lot of the things that were discussed in that video about whether people can listen to you, whether they're accessible or in Peru, and things like that. I think that what I have learned most over the last years is that people don't understand that if you can't speak for yourself, which is true of about half of us near the end of our life, that it isn't automatic the way it is in some states. Colorado has a very interesting law that says that all of the interested people come around the table and have an equal potential voice. And we as providers try to help facilitate their coming to a decision about who can best speak in your voice. It's a very strange law. It actually started in the 1980s during the HIV epidemic, when there were people who were not legally recognized. There were people who would know somebody's values best when people were estranged from their families. And it's a very cool law, but people don't understand that if you don't decide, then all of these people are going to get around the table. And that may sound like, for some people, it's a kumbaya kind of thing, like, oh, I know that Ralph is the right person. But frankly, there can be a lot of fighting and disagreements. And it really is important for you to decide who that person and a couple of backups are, to make sure that your voice gets heard. So what about people? Do you have people in your practice who've outlived all their relatives, who may be estranged? What do you tell patients?
Yeah, that actually has come up, unfortunately, for those people. And they ask, who, if I don't have family, who do I ask? And really what I try to do first is direct them to close friends, maybe good neighbors that would be willing to speak for them, people that they've known for a long time and feel comfortable talking to about this. If they belong to a faith community, sometimes they'll know somebody within that community that will be willing to help them, and also maybe trade off. They'll be your spokesperson you'll be theirs. So that's a possibility. There's also professionals that this is what they do. They can work with you and be your healthcare proxy if you need one. And so that's also an option that I've spoken to a few of my patients about.
It costs something, but that's certainly an option. I know that in my ethics consultation career, I've had people who have 5 kids, and they choose their best friend from high school because they say the 5 kids are never going to be able to resolve this. So somebody who's a little bit further away is the one who should speak for me. It's a tricky thing.
It is. It is hard sometimes for some people, I think.
So the next question is, what matters most to you, to me, and thinking that through yourself, and then also then being able to share with those people who you would want to make decision for you, because the decision maker you have is only as good as what you've told them about what's important to you. And I know you guys use the tool that I'm most familiar with, which is the Conversation Project Starter Kit. And the interesting thing about that is it doesn't say, I want to be intubated, I want CPR, I don't want CPR, et cetera. It says what matters most to me. What are my values? What would make life worth living? And like that graph from The Economist, what would be worse than death for me? And that might shift over time.
Exactly. Like I tell people, it's an ongoing conversation. And I think we kind of talk about that later on.
So unfortunately, we don't have a live audience here, Elizabeth. I like to, this is one of the Likert scales, they call them, that comes out of that starter kit. So I'll have to just ask you, what are your concerns about treatment near the end of life? Would they be that you were worried that you wouldn't get enough care? Or would you be worried that you would get overly aggressive care, or are you down the middle?
I think I'm kind of biased as a healthcare provider. I think many of us would say, I would say I would be more on the I'm worried I'll get overly aggressive care. So I have made sure to talk to my family about what's important to me, and I wouldn't want to be here if blank kind of statements, so that they kind of know that.
I think here we are in Boulder, and I think there are a lot of people who lean more towards that end of the spectrum. But I know that in my ethics practice, there are certainly pockets of people and important groups of people in this society who are worried that they won't get enough care because we don't have an equal healthcare system, and there's a lot of injustice and a lot of fear that your status in society will lead to less care than you might want or than another person will get. Yeah.
So one thing we've been sort of talking about is that this really isn't a one and done conversation. That's what I tell my patients. This is an ongoing conversation that I have with them, and they should have with their families. We should all have with our families, because what's important to, I would say for myself, what's important to me now probably will be completely different, maybe in 30 years from now, if I'm lucky to live that long. So don't assume too. The other thing that I've heard from people is that, oh, my family knows what I want. So I would say don't assume. Really have that conversation with them. It's a gift that you give to them to tell them what's important to you in your life and what makes your life have good quality. And you really can't know that unless you talk together.
There is a very interesting study that says that the longer you and your partner have been together, the less likely you are to be able to predict what they want, which I find extremely weird and sobering. But when you think about it, I mean, I've been married for 52 years, so we don't talk anymore. No, I'm just kidding. But we assume that we know what the other guy wants, you know? And so we have a tendency not to think about it. I think that's probably why that study came out the way it did. So, yeah.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah,
so,
just having a little, there we go.
Okay, so there's lots of flavors of documents. What are your thoughts and your take on them, Elizabeth?
Well, we talk about this, and I like the way this is ordered. I think the most important document is the medical durable power of attorney. That's the one where you write down on paper who is the person or people who are going to be speaking for you if you cannot speak because of an illness. The second most important one, and this is not for everybody, this is only for people. For some people, is what is called the Medical Orders for Scope of Treatment, or in Colorado, it's called the MOST form. This form has several different questions that you go through, and we'll be talking about that in a minute. And then I think less important are the living will and the CPR directive. And really, the CPR directive is included in the MOST form, so it's sort of redundant. And the living will is nice if you really want to write down on paper some very specific things about your end-of-life wishes, but not necessary, I would say. And I don't know what your thoughts are, Jean.
No, I think I agree with you completely. I think the living will has such narrow application, although there are multiple flavors if you go online of living wills. But in general, we have so many things that we do to people, for people, that get them in all sorts of strange situations that it's impossible for people to write down, this is what I'd want in this situation, this is what I'd want in the other. So getting your medical durable power of attorney, telling them what matters to you and what values you have. And then at the end of life, as we'll talk about, filling out a MOST form, which is a different flavor of advanced directive that we'll talk about. I agree. So this is the form, I think, at BCH that they can pull up in that section of the website. And a reminder that, couple of reminders that we wanted to do to people. One is it doesn't need to be notarized despite popular rumors. And you said it doesn't need even to be witnessed, but it is important to upload it then into your electronic medical record.
Yeah, exactly. So this form is shared. I think this is from the Colorado Hospital Association. And yeah, paper is good. Electronic is nice. You can do it either way. At BCH, we do have an electronic medical record that actually is shared by most of the major health systems in this area. And what's really nice now with these electronic systems is, even though a good portion of the chart is not shared directly, this part of your chart is. So What I tell my patients is, God forbid you show up in an ER and you're unable to speak, and it's one of our local ERs, they can see underneath your name in the chart, like, has advanced care planning documents. They click on that link, and then they can see your medical power of attorney and any other documents you've decided to save in your chart. So it's a great place to store it. It's a permanent place, but also great for communication with any healthcare providers you might encounter who don't know you.
Agreed. And then we've got the most form. I think this one's confusing and really misused. It's the most recent form. How do you like to use it, Elizabeth? And how do you want your patients to be using it?
So I think one thing that people get confused about, this is really a form you fill out with your doctor. I've had some patients tell me, oh yeah, I filled out one of those with my lawyer. It's really a doctor's order. And it's really a conversation you need to have with your doctor or your advanced care provider. So really, this form I use when patients. Most often, I use it when patients tell me that they'd like to be allowed to die naturally. Should they be lucky enough to die suddenly? Their heart should stop. They're not breathing. They've died naturally. They don't want to have CPR. And that's really an order for the emergency medical providers who may be called to the home to tell them, don't do CPR. And then there's all these other sections, which Jean, you and I talked about. It's sort of this, it can be a little confusing, I think, this kind of menu in this form. I can tell you what I talk about with my patients. For Part B, really the decision is, do you want to be on a ventilator, a breathing machine, or not? And then they ask questions about whether you want to have artificial nutrition at any point, and then the section D is just who it was discussed with. So it's a lot of ranges of treatments that they ask about. And I don't know what you've experienced with talking with people about this form.
Yeah. The ER perspective is an interesting one. It's useful in the ER and it's useful for the ambulance folks because it says, yes, attempt CPR, attempt resuscitation, or no. That's an important thing to know in the first 5 minutes. And then the first 5 minutes, just as you say, do you want a full court press? Do you want intubation, the ICU, and things like that? Or would you like comfort-focused care, which avoids all of that stuff, but may require being in the hospital? Usually you need to come to the ER and have people sort out, oh, where can we keep you most comfortable? Or something in between. That selective treatment thing requires a lot of conversation. So I try to tell my folks in the ER, my peeps, this is something you look at in the first 5 minutes. CPR, yes, no. Intubation and full court press, yes, no. And after that, you need a conversation. And these are orders based on your current healthcare. This is not something that you say, well, 5 years from now, I don't think I'd want to be intubated. This is based on your medical condition, and usually is something for the last 6 to 12 months of life, when you sort of know the trajectory of how your exit is going to look. Is it going to be a respiratory thing? Is it heart failure? Is it kidney failure? What intensity of treatment do I want?
Yeah, I think certainly for my patients, it's the part A about, CPR, no CPR, because if you're lucky enough to die suddenly and painlessly, like we said at the beginning of the talk, for most of us, that's a blessing, and they don't want to be brought back, especially if they're unlikely to be independent or live in the way they currently live. But yeah, like you said, sometimes people don't know for Part B what they want, and what I tell my patients is that if you've done that medical power of attorney, if you've had that discussion with your family, you don't necessarily need to decide, I don't want to be on a ventilator for Part B. Certainly, I have patients who know they don't want to be on a ventilator, and they say that. And certainly for some of my patients who do have a terminal illness, they know they only want comfort care. Right. And then for Part C, I often discuss with my patients what are the, known risks and are there any benefits to artificial nutrition? So those are things to talk about with your healthcare provider.
Right, and there are reasons for being on artificial hydration and nutrition. They're not usually at the end of life, which is where this form is applicable. Good points.
Exactly.
All right, the next part of your tasks is who do you need to talk to? I just found this from a colleague on the net. Why should we care? That's their problem. If we don't talk to our kids, well, right. Well, at least we talked about it. Sadly.
Yeah, and sometimes I ask patients, have you thought about your plan or what you want at the end of your life? And they'll start talking about their funeral arrangements. So I just want to make sure that make sure you're talking about everything that happens before the funeral, not the funeral arrangements. That's not as important.
There's a palliative care doc in California who says that when she gets one of her patients, she says, have you talked to your daughter or whoever? And says, let's get them on the phone. And then they have a three-way conversation in the office. So it is hard to break the ice. It is hard to talk about things. Here's another little clip to sort of explain what the challenges can be.
So I figured it would be a really easy conversation. My parents were really open to it. They thought it was a good idea. And I could not get myself to start it.
It was really something that made me uneasy. And it was something that I was really uncomfortable with.
So I knew that I should have it. And somehow I think found every reason not to have it.
I wasn't ready to think about what does it mean that my dad's going to pass away at some point and how do we deal with that.
So instead of having the conversation with my family, I did end up having the conversation with several of my friends from a similar cultural background.
I never thought that I would have to make decisions like this for my mom. I started to just listen in a very, very present way to every single thing that she had to say. And then suddenly I started to know what questions to ask, and they weren't clinical questions. It was like, at what point, Mom, do you want me to step in and help make decisions for your life? And she said to me, well, at the point at which I can't sit down and pray with you kids. And that's really poignant. That's not making a decision about a ventilator. That's not making a do not resuscitate decision. That's something very, very simple. And all I could say to her is, yes, Mom, I will do that for you.
My sister and I had very different views about what we should be doing. And in our conversations, it wasn't about what I wanted or what my sister wanted. It was about what my dad wanted and now what my mom will want for her care. What was important for my dad was that he be at home with his family. He did not want to be in the hospital while he was really ill. And it turned out that he wanted to die at home, and we were able to do that for him.
I think we really talked about the spirit of what is life to you and what does it mean. And I think my mom, the most powerful thing she said was, you just need to know to tell the care professionals who are taking care of me or him who we are when we're not in a hospital bed. And if they know that, I have no doubt that you'll be able to have a conversation with them about what is the right kind of treatment.
I think it made us closer because we were able to talk about and emotionally deal with how we felt. That I could tell my dad, I love you and I don't want to talk about this, but we need to talk about it. And we got to respect each other for that.
And now, knowing how comfortable my mom is, and it only came from that conversation, we're much more comfortable that it's just another stage in life, and it will be just fine.
So this video is mostly from the perspective of a younger person talking to an older person, but it's the flip. I've seen older people who say, oh, I can't talk about this with my kids. Have you seen the same thing, Elizabeth?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. Not sure how to start the conversation or how to bring them together to have it. You know, it can be awkward, I think.
Yeah, and sometimes you can pivot off of somebody in the news. I remember when Nelson Mandela was dying, it was a trigger for conversations about, gee, I wouldn't want to be in a hospital bed in my home for 6 months, et cetera. Or I need to hear this. I like the guy who said, I need to do this so that I can respect you. And I know that there are people, the Conversation Project suggests that at Thanksgiving or sometime when you've got the whole family gathered together, that you talk turkey at Thanksgiving and gather it's still hard to do. A story for you. A story for you that, I think we all learn lessons from our own life. This was my mother. She was 85. She had multi-infarct dementia that was progressive. And she really wanted to go home to her husband who had died 5 years before. There wasn't a whole lot besides her very annoying cat, Benji, who gave her any pleasure in life. And she got a urinary tract infection. And I am the oldest of 3 kids. I had the MDPOA because I'm the medical person and I was the oldest. And so I called my 2 brothers and I said, what do you think? Do you think we should treat this infection or not? And they were just stunned. They said, well, of course you treat a urinary tract infection. I mean, our wives get urinary tract infections. You get urinary tract infections. It's simple to treat. And I sort of said to them, well, it's a choice. She isn't getting a lot of joy in life right now. She isn't able to respond to her environment. And they said, well, it's so simple. Of course we're going to do that. So despite being the MDPOA, here's one of the catches of being the MDPOA is you still have to live with the other people in your life. And so I wasn't about to overrule them, even though I didn't think that was particularly what she would choose if she could choose. And so we treated her urinary tract infection. And about 6 weeks after that, one of my 2 brothers called me up and he said, I get it now. I think maybe next time we should just make her comfortable and not treat the infection. Have you seen stuff like that, Elizabeth?
Yeah, definitely. I think it really highlights the need to talk to the whole family. Even if you've designated a medical power of attorney, is sharing, your wishes with everyone so that everyone's on the same page. And really those, I would say more often it's the siblings, right? So that all of the siblings are on the same page and can support each other. So if you're, if everybody can be on the same page, it's important to discuss it with everybody, for sure.
Yeah. So you're the one who is the provider and the receiver on this. And it's important for us to understand what you would want to hear and what you want us to bring to the table when we're your patient.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's such a gift to me as a primary care provider to share in these conversations with my patients, and also important because there have been times where I've been called from a hospital or an ED to ask, have you talked with your patient? What do they want? So bring your primary care provider for sure, and any other important healthcare providers in on this conversation. Share with them what's important to you in your life. And if you really want to sit down and have a longer conversation, your provider will be paid for that. I think I've heard from patients that they're worried they'll just take too much of their provider's time and or that they don't have time for this. They do have time for this, and it's really important. Make a specific appointment for this discussion. You can bring other family members with you. Just like Jean was saying earlier, her friend who calls family members on the phone to join in the conversation, you can bring important people with you, so you don't have to be alone. And you can use some of these guides that we've discussed, and they're available for you to help you if you're not really sure where to go with this conversation either. And then talk about it yearly. Really, if you're a Medicare-aged person and you're on Medicare, it is something that in our annual wellness visit we're supposed to bring up with you and ask, has anything changed? Or do you even have a medical power of attorney or any documents like that? And what are your wishes? And then year to year, what's changed? What's important to you now? Is it still the same as it was last year when we discussed it? And then it's also really important, like we talked about, to if you have a serious illness develop or a serious hospitalization happen, is to bring it back up again and talk about it in the context of those occurrences. So really, like I said before, it's just this ongoing conversation that you have.
Well,
do you have anything else to add? Yeah.
Well, with your wellness visit, I'm sure you have a checklist of about 78 things that you're supposed to cover during that. And frankly, there are providers who are more comfortable with this than not. And I think their patients shouldn't be so shy about bringing it up. Somebody has pointed out that this whole advanced directive movement is actually a grassroots one, basically. I know Ellen Goodman, who started the Conversation Project, pointed that out, that this is people saying, whoa, wait a minute, I don't necessarily want you to do everything, that quality of life may be more important for me than quantity of life. That's true for about 85% of people. For the 15% that every day is sacred, it's even more important for them to talk to their provider about this. But there are grassroots movements that have happened around childbirth and around other healthcare concerns in our society. And I think this is one. And if you need to nudge or you need to make an appointment, Medicare has said, hey, wait a minute, this is so important that we'll let providers charge for just having this conversation with you, with your surrogates, and as many times in a year as is needed.
Right.
So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is.
So over the last couple of decades, there's sort of developed a best practice in terms of advanced care planning, which is the name for this whole big thing that we're talking about here. And basically, people have divided it into 3 steps, and you'll see various forms of these steps in whatever healthcare system. Boulder Community has it, Kaiser has it, others have it. But the first step is that everybody who's of age, whether you call that 18 or 50 or whatever, needs to have a medical durable power of attorney. They call it POAHC in this graph. But you need to think about and practice thinking about what would happen if I blew an aneurysm in my head or hit my head on a rock mountain biking or something like that. And just sort of start to think about it and think, who would you want to speak for you? And that'll change over time. I remember giving this presentation in a group a few years ago, and lady said, no problem, my sister's going to speak for me, I got it. And then she sort of paused and said, wait a minute, she died a couple of years ago. I guess I should update it. So
that happens too, right? Yeah.
And then the next step is the one Elizabeth was just talking about, is when you develop a serious illness or a chronic disease, then you need to do a cross-check. Okay, do I have a person, and I talk to them, who would speak for me if I can't? Or what will happen the next time I have a downturn? And you need to sort of think about things a little more seriously and cross-check, are my values still the same as they were when I was a young whippersnapper and thought that if I couldn't climb 14ers, life wasn't worth it, okay? And then the last step is this last 12 months or so, when you need to sit down actually with your provider and translate your values into those orders we in Colorado call the MOST form. That's when you translate these hopes, wishes, and what's important to you into direct orders. So that's sort of the best practices these days. And you'll see these segments in most healthcare systems now.
And if you're not sure where you are, this is where, again, a good idea to talk to your healthcare provider, and, about how you feel things are going versus, how they feel things are going too.
So Elizabeth, do you have some final thoughts before we take some questions, or anything you'd like to leave people with, particularly that we haven't covered?
Something that we haven't covered, I do feel like I'm kind of repeating myself, but I think, again, just reiterating, it's really just what this is all about is just thinking about what's important to you and what makes your life worth living, and then sharing that with people around you who care about you. That's really what if anybody walks away from, when you walk away from this talk, I hope that's what you take away, is that this is an important conversation, and though you may not know it, they most likely want to have it too, or have been wondering about it too. So that would be what I would want people to take away.
Yeah, it's sort of a gift to them to break the ice and push them into it. So I'm sort of the ethicist in this, or the sometime ethicist, and I think it's important for us to realize that our thoughts about this have really morphed at sort of light speed compared to the whole arc of human history, and that we've come a long ways. This is a picture of Nancy Cruzan. She was one of the people that started this whole talk about talking. And she was in 1985, a 25-year-old who was in an auto accident late at night. She lost control of her car, and EMS found her face down in a ditch, not breathing. They resuscitated her. And she was in what at that point was called a persistent vegetative state. She got a feeding tube, and she never regained consciousness. And after 3 years, her family said, could we please remove the feeding tube? She is not getting better. We do not want her to continue to suffer as they felt she was in this state. And there was a whole legal wrangling in the state of Missouri. The courts first said, sure, as parents, you can make decisions for her. And then the state of Missouri said, no, unless there's clear and convincing evidence. It went back and forth for 5 years. And finally, there was a decision that the parents were allowed to withdraw the feeding tube. And on her gravestone, you'll notice that there is a 7-year gap between when she departed from their idea of when this accident happened till when she was at peace. And she was one of those people that triggered us to think about, wow, how is it that we're dying? And how is it that we should take control over our death? Technology has done some amazing things to extend our life, but for some people, it has also extended the process of dying. Katie Butler, I know, says that we live often some of us live in the gray zone for a long period of time. The next slide there, Elizabeth. I love this sort of diagram that talks about the acts and omissions that lead to death. It's pretty rare to have a natural death these days. The first thing that happened was we said you don't have to have CPR attempts to restart you if you're dead. And then we said, well, wait a minute, it's okay to not start life-sustaining treatments. You don't have to go on the ventilator if you don't want to. And a little after that, psychologically a little bit, ethically a little bit harder is, no, even after those have started, we can withdraw them if people say, or if the family speaking for the patient says, no, she doesn't want this. And that's become very acceptable in our society over the last 20 years, since in 1991, the Patient Self-Determination Act became federal law. More recently, palliative care has been extremely helpful in teaching us that people are allowed to voluntarily stop eating and drinking near the end of their life. And that if their symptoms cannot be controlled and their suffering can't be managed, that they can be sedated, even if that is to unconsciousness, proportionate to their suffering. And now we're getting into the legal gray zone of medical aid in dying, which is legally acceptable in Colorado and in 11 states, I think, at this point, and about 25% of the population. For us in the United States, euthanasia or physicians causing the death or giving the medications is illegal. Although in Canada and some other places, that is considered acceptable. So we have changed an awful lot in the last 30 or 40 years. It's no wonder that people are a little uncomfortable and not sure where they stand and why we're struggling with this as a society. So I'll let you go on. This is, I guess, what we don't want, which is somebody else to decide for us. Because of your age, I'm going to recommend doing nothing. I guess that's the way you play doctor in 2022, huh, Elizabeth? All right, and a recap with some links, and then let's take some questions.
So yeah, hopefully we met the goals, which I think we skipped. I skipped over the beginning. We met the goals of our discussion, and here on the slides are some links that we mentioned that hopefully will be helpful for you. So yeah, let's take some questions.
Great. Can you ladies hear me?
Yes.
Fabulous. I think if you quit sharing the screen during question, there you go. Excellent. Excellent. All right, I'll start my video too. So we have had several questions come through, and I'm sure there'll be several more. So I'll start with the ones that we've collected so far. So the first question is, do you have any suggestions, or can you guide us a little bit on how to deal with children who don't agree on final care?
Jean, you want to take that one?
It's very hard. The proactive conversation, the sitting down and say, this is about me. This is what I want. I need you guys to be together on this, and writing down some of the orders, because that does relieve them. I remember one time there was a family whose mother suddenly had a very, very severe stroke. Son came in, was not clear. It wasn't a disagreement among the kids, but he looked at the written directives that she had written, and he said, boy, that's not what I would have guessed that she wanted, but I see that this is in her own handwriting, and I know that that's what she would want. So that the written statement, some people these days have actually done video statements also to say what's important to them. Again, may need to be updated, but any way that you can communicate directly and get those disagreements out in the open before you no longer can. Any other suggestions, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think just to reiterate what you said, I think that would be a case where the living will would be helpful. You know, like you said, writing these things down. It's not always necessary, but in those cases certainly would be helpful to the family.
And more than just the form, the Kinko form for a living will is writing in a paragraph or two or three what makes life meaningful, what you don't want, so that it's very clear. Because actually things written by you when you had decisional capacity trump what your surrogates wish. And the problem is it causes lots of ethics consults, because we don't like overriding the surrogate who is speaking for someone who can't speak for themselves. So it's tricky, but technically, legally, the person's wishes, if they're relevant to the situation, should hold.
Wonderful. There's a question here that I also had. My father lives in North Carolina, and my sister and I live here in Colorado, and I'm working to be his power of medical attorney. And so this question is, since you mentioned that different states have different guidelines, will the state of residence be honored, and suggestions on how to handle that? So, you know, I have gone to North Carolina, the hospital that he's most likely will be in. They're just like BCH has forms on their site, so does Cone Hospital. Now, that's the question: are these directives honored out of state?
So the general hierarchy, if the patient can't decide for themselves at the time, and remember, these don't kick in if you can still make decisions for yourself when you're sick. But the hierarchy is a guardian, which you would know if that were the case. The person who is assigned by the patient when they have decision-making capacity. That's the purpose of the MDPOA. And then if the person doesn't have that form, like Amy, like you would have that form, then each state has a hierarchy of people and a way to decide who the proxy will be. Ours is a strange system. We in Hawaii only have that allows close friends to be equals at the table with family members. Most states have a hierarchy that says spouse first, then the eldest son, or the kids, and then, you know, does a rank order kind of thing. So the MDPOA trumps all of that stuff, and that's what you really need. And that should be honored in any state. If it's you and you want it to be sure that if when you travel, it's honored, get a notary and get some witnesses. But otherwise, once your dad assigns you, is he able to make decisions at this point, Amy?
Yes.
Okay, so that's the perfect time to be doing that. That's why you start practicing way at the beginning.
Yeah, we've started. So please talk a little bit more about the post paradigm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a national movement, the pulse paradigm system. And then each state, of course, had to have their own name and their own particularities about it. And so, Elizabeth, you've talked about and used the one in Colorado, which is called the MOST form.
Right, exactly. So it's just a naming thing, right, Jean? It's just that's the issue. Like everybody has to have their own special name for the same, it's a very similar form.
It's rights, you know, well, let's not go there.
Yeah.
But they all have the same parts, which is CPR attempts, yes, no, and then this nuanced decision about what level of aggressiveness you would want.
Yeah, okay. Do you know about the financial power of attorney? Is that part of the medical durable power of attorney?
I always tell my patients, thank goodness, no. I don't want to know anything about your finances. And that please don't share that with me. No, they're totally separate. A lot of lawyers, though, will sort of include the medical power of attorney. It's really a free thing. You don't need a lawyer for it, but they'll just include it when you're doing your financial end-of-life documents, so like your will, financial power of attorney. So two very separate things, but often are glommed together by lawyers. And honestly, I don't think, even though some of the lawyers are good at, they're really not, this is not their training to talk about the medical power of attorney. So they're trying to provide a service, but I really would suggest you talk to your provider, your healthcare provider, about the medical power of attorney and or living will, most form, whatever it is you decide you need to fill out. So
yeah, I think that's exactly right, Elizabeth. It usually comes in a package of 40 pages that they print out, and they are not qualified to do it, and it's very scary. But on the other hand, the medical profession, that's us, has probably abrogated their responsibility by not being comfortable enough having this. I know some people who've asked one kid to be the medical decision maker and another kid to be the financial one, just to help share and join in the responsibilities and balance it a little.
my parents are lucky. They have a lawyer and a doctor, so that's how they've divided it up in our family.
Right. This is another question similar. If a medical durable power of attorney is stored online, is it accessible to other hospitals? For example, if you're, in the closest DR and it's not BCH.
Yes, I'm gonna assume from the question that if it's, you mean online, if it's in your the electronic medical record. And I would say yes, even if we don't share the same, like they can't see it, we can always, we're open most days of the week. We can print it out, fax it the old-fashioned way. So it's just, like I said, another place to store it. It shouldn't be the only place you store it. You should have it, at home in a file, either electronic or paper, and you should not be the only person who knows where that is. You should make sure that your family knows where to find that paperwork as well. So, it's just having those redundant systems is sometimes a helpful thing in a crisis.
And I'll push back a little bit. I think that the transmission of information is very aspirational at this point. And when EMS needs to know things like CPR and who makes decisions for you, we do not yet have a system. There's been a law passed in Colorado 2 years ago that said we need to develop an electronic registry for these things. But it has not come to fruition yet, and they're still squabbling about who's going to be the vendor and all that kind of stuff. So Elizabeth is right. If you are in somebody that's in the Epic system, which is a lot of hospitals, they will be able to pull it up, but it should be in your file of life on the refrigerator, or there are cards. I know the Conversation Project distributes them that have your MDPOA and our wallet cards. So the more places you can have that plastered, the more likely you are for people to be able to find the person who you would want to speak for you.
Perfect. About the EMTs, a question is, rumor has it that EMTs routinely ignore most forms. Do you think this is true?
Oh dear. I must say that I've spent much of my life trying to teach them to listen to most forms. If they are not readily accessible, if they are not clear, or if there is a big argument at the scene or something like that, the EMTs, the paramedics, will stabilize people and take them to the hospital. And so I actually think that the hub of the decision-making actually comes from the ER. That's not because I'm an ER doc, but because we are the ones who should be looking at that most form saying, this is what that means. The most form should work for no CPR if you're in a cardiac arrest, but more often the ambulance is called, 911 is called because you've got respiratory distress or whatever. If you get intubated and it turns out that your most form says you didn't want to be intubated, there is no reason that the ER can't, in a very controlled, compassionate, comfortable way, extubate you. All of this stuff can be reversed, can be strategized in the ER. Okay, this person wants to be comfortable, would rather not be admitted to the hospital. Okay, let's figure out how to make that happen. Do we need to call hospice in right now, etc.? On the other hand, I had a mother-in-law who was on comfort care. Even that is hard to sort out, who fell and broke 5 ribs and had a whole half lung full of fluid. And we decided that the best way to make her comfortable was to admit her to the hospital with a chest tube. And she was there for 5 days. And that was comfort care for her. So these are very complex, sophisticated decisions that need to be made.
What happens if one is undergoing surgery and things don't go well? Do surgeons make the decision on the spot or bring the patient out of surgery?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of times surgeons, what I've seen, and Jean, you know more about the legal, of course, and ethics about this, but I'll see them revoke the DNR. Like, so if you have a I don't want to be resuscitated order, they will revoke that around the time of surgery after hopefully after a conversation with you. So that's
the key. Yeah.
Yeah.
They should revisit it. They may ask for it to be suspended around the time of surgery as part of their agreement to do the surgery. And they're allowed to decline to do the surgery in the face of a, no, I still want to be DNR, because there's a lot of things that happen in anesthesia and surgery that are almost like dying. You know, you stop breathing, you get intubated, you're on medications and stuff like that. So it needs to be a conversation and a dialogue about, no, some people will say, we actually have forms in some hospitals that say, no, I want my DNR continued. and the surgeon can either say, I'm not comfortable doing it under those circumstances, or okay, or I want a full court press if you think you can bring me back to the state I was in before, or something in between.
And I think that's important to say is what you said is that you don't have to revoke it. If you know, you can keep it if the surgeon agrees to that. I've seen that, you know, in many patients who are having a surgery because something happened, like they broke a hip and they can't go on without like having that hip pinned and fixed. But yeah, anyway, I think that was a great point.
Wonderful. Can you talk a little bit more about nourishment and water? I think that was one of the kind of middle steps you either decide to do or not.
So, so there have been lots of studies looking at artificially hydrating and giving artificial nutrition to people who are basically terminally ill, who are dying. And what they found is that does not prolong life in any meaningful way, and often introduces more complications and more pain and suffering. So, but that's different than other things. You know, there are times where artificial hydration and nutrition can be helpful. So it really depends on the situation that you're in. And I'm sure you could say a lot more about that, Jean.
Well, yeah, there are times when you're using it as a bridge to healing, and your body will heal faster if you get artificial hydration and nutrition because your gut can't absorb something. Near the end of life, you talked about the person who's actively dying or in those last few days, and bodies shut down and they can't absorb food. The kidneys can't handle hydration. And you're right, they can make things worse. They increase salivation and sweat and choking and things like that. In dementia, when people get to the point where they need a feeding tube or you know, a stomach tube or something like that, it turns out that does not extend life. And I think for the better, it's becoming much more clear to most everybody that when somebody is so debilitated that they need artificial nutrition, that is not helpful. On the other hand, there are people who passionately believe that that's part of being a human, and that feeding and hydration are so essential that that's not a medicine, that is an essential part of being alive. So different people will come down differently on it.
Yeah, definitely. I think sometimes what I try to explain is part of the process. Like you said, it's part of the body shutting down. It's a natural process to not feel hungry and not be thirsty. And yeah, and we can treat those symptoms if they do have them, and make people comfortable so that they don't feel those symptoms.
This is I kind of thought this question would come up. Is there anything being worked on, developed, programs, assistance, I think, for those who don't want to live through dementia, especially Alzheimer's, so they don't want to die alone? I believe this is related to the question of doctor-assisted suicide. What if someone is just done?
You know, I don't know.
So people who have dementia do not have, at least at the end, do not have decision-making capacity, so they are not eligible for medical assistance in dying. However, there are things called dementia directives. I think there's some on the Conversation Project website, and there may be a link to at Boulder Community. So you can still tell your family what you want before you get dementia, which directs them to say, when I get to this stage, please do not admit me to the hospital, do not do antibiotics, all of the complications that cause death in dementia. Once you are unable to make decisions, remember that the most form can still be filled out by your surrogates and the doctors. They can sit down and say, and your loved one can say, you know, mom would not want to go to the hospital. She would want comfort care only. She would not want CPR. All those parts of the MOST form can be decided upon and then signed by the doctor with the surrogate. Have you done many conversations, Elizabeth, with surrogates in the MOST form? I don't think it's that uncommon, is it?
No, it's certainly not uncommon. I think it's sometimes what I found is that if that hasn't been talked about before, it's a hard conversation to have as a surrogate. So again, it's so important to talk about it before you get to that stage. But yes, certainly is done, and to really uphold the wishes of the person with dementia, to make sure that their desires, their values are upheld.
It's an important question, though, because I think that's one of the things people fear most in any forum that I talk in is, what do I do to control life if I get dementia and can't make decisions for myself? That's a toughie.
Excellent. Do you think conservators are ethical if no one is available to make decisions? I have seen some cases where conservatives have been prosecuted.
I personally haven't
I'm
seen
going to have
that.
to pass on that. I don't work with conservators, and I'm not sure what their legal status is. So do you, Elizabeth, at all?
I've only, I think that's usually it's from a very unfortunate situation that somebody has a conservator. And I've only had probably a couple of times in my career where, and luckily those worked out. So I haven't luckily seen an unethical conservator. So can't say I have much to say about that.
This guest says, I don't carry my MOST form, my MOST form around with me. Will a DNR bracelet be considered a legal order?
Yes, if it's a legal, yeah. If there's usually a phone number that people call associated with it, and to confirm that it's a part of a registry. And there's a couple of different bracelets, or Road ID has bracelets that you can get that are DNR ones, and they should be honored.
Are you familiar with the organization Compassion and Choices? And are you familiar with Colorado Dying with Dignity?
Yes, I'm sure you are too, yes. It's a great resource.
Yeah, Compassion and Choices is the new formation of the old Hemlock Society that many people will remember. They are an advocacy group. They've been doing some amazing work. They mostly now work legislatively through the states to try to develop medical assistance in dying laws. And so their advocacy has been very helpful. What was the second half of the question? I can't remember.
Well, it was both about these organizations, Compassion and Choices and Colorado Dying with Dignity organization.
I think they are the linked organization with Compassion and Choices. And again, these are advocacy organizations. I know physicians need more of a medicalized basis for this. But some of these organizations are very good at figuring out where people can be referred and reminding people of what the requirements are for medical assistance in dying. And they're very facilitative.
Wonderful. This guest asks, do you have suggestions? My parents did not want their info on their fridge or posted anywhere. This is their DNR, or they did not want their, I guess their DNR or their info on their fridge or posted anywhere. Wish there was a better place for that, so it isn't so glaring to just have it there. Do you have any suggestion?
Well, the problem is, I know I've heard of paramedics who it's on the back of the door And they fling the door open when they come in and of course miss it. There's sort of a catch-22 here. It's a little bit less easy to communicate if you don't have it out there and in your face. I know that a lot of organizations have a file of life, which is just a little plastic magnetic file that you put on the side of your refrigerator, and it isn't quite as conspicuous as a giant thing that says DNR, which I would hate to have every time I open my freezer too. But so there's a little file of life, and then you can use something in your wallet. And then when you're out at Target, if you collapse, one of the people there should be able to look through it and figure things out pretty fast.
What about the insides of the kitchen cabinets, Jean? I've heard that is another place the EMTs will look on the inside of the doors. Is that not a good place to tell people to put this documentation?
Well, I know that I have too many cabinet doors. I don't know which one to put it on.
You have a big kitchen.
I've heard of people putting it in their freezer. Or what we have at our house is one of the file cabinets has our emergency information with a sticker on the front of the file cabinet, and the front file is emergency information. Now that's a little bit more than just your MDPOA or your CPR directive. Those are the two things that it would be nice if we had a registry, and if every time the EMS arrived, you'd type up the name of the person and figure out what their wishes are, but we aren't there yet, unfortunately. So you're going to have to choose between garish and subtle.
Right. Is the legal age for doing these documents 18 or 21 years of age?
I think in Colorado it's 18. But one would need to check on that. I think it's 18 is the age of consent.
I see. Yeah. Okay. About that, do you recommend younger people prepare these documents?
Just the one, right,
Yeah.
Elizabeth? Yeah.
Yeah, the medical power of attorney, there's no, I don't think there's any too young to have that if, especially in Colorado where you need to name the person you want to speak for you. I don't bring it up that often with younger folks, but there probably isn't too young an age as far once you've hit 18.
But I think many of us, like Elizabeth and me, think that the checkbox kind of wishes, like I don't want to be intubated, I don't want CPR, are even when you're 60 or 70, maybe when you're 80, are just too specified. It depends on the situation. There was a patient we had an ethics consult on because he had a community-acquired pneumonia, and he'd had to be in the ICU, and it was now day 7, and he had one of those form directives that said no more than 7 days on the ventilator. Well, he had a community-acquired pneumonia, and it was going to be 8 days. And the docs didn't want to extubate him at a time when they thought, well, the risk of having to put the tube back in is high enough. Let's give it another day or two. And the ethics committee eventually sort of said, let's let it extend. I think the intent was that somebody didn't want to be forever on a ventilator. That's a fair enough request, but let's give him a chance. And he actually wheeled out a week later saying, thank you for not listening to the number and listening to the intent.
Right. It's true. People have to make different decisions now, right? Based on COVID. Maybe you don't want to have a DNR, you may think through, maybe you say it's good for any time other than if I get COVID, because maybe I need to be on a ventilator, but then and I will survive it that way. So I can see how COVID and some of these other illnesses can make people have to think about it a little bit differently. Talking about dementia, this guest says, makes me think about those with mental illness. How is this population treated? How are they What if you never have an opportunity to put, forms together because you're just not capable?
Have you experienced this?
I haven't personally, but I mean, one of the things people have to have decision-making capability to be able to fill out these forms. So, I mean, mental illness is so broad. Certainly, some people are so ill, they may not have capacity or ability to make these decisions. But, if they're stable and they're able to understand what their decisions mean and can explain that, then I think that's a different thing. What would you say?
Yeah, you don't per se lose your decision-making capacity just because you carry a diagnosis of manic depression or schizophrenia or anything else. The criteria for decision-making capacity are very clear, and physicians know how to decide. Do you understand the consequences of your choices? And can you tell us why you're making that choice? A lot of people with mental illness will have times, as you point out, Elizabeth, of great stability and capacity. And there are actually psychiatric directives, advanced directives, which say, if I lose my capacity, if I become manic and I can't think at all, here's the medicines that you may give me, here's where I would like to be admitted, that kind of thing, which is very helpful for us in the ER, for instance, when somebody comes in and they are out of control. And so I know in Washington State and some other states, there are actual forms that you can print out that say you would sit down with your doc and say, okay, here's what should happen when I lose capacity.
Great. I think we have time for a couple of more questions, and I do have two more that have come in, and one is related to my question a minute ago. Are there COVID specific forms?
I don't know. I'm not. Are there?
Yeah, there are. And they're on your website. I think they're on the BCH website. I know they're on the Conversation Project website, so that you could just link to there through BCH. But there are specific ones, and they're related to that problem of, oh, you know what, with COVID, if I'm going to die, it's probably going to be a respiratory failure death on a ventilator in the ICU without my family being able to be around, although that's softening now, thank goodness, in terms of visitation. But it's specific for the time of COVID. And there's a couple of other organizations that also have COVID-specific advanced directives. Good question.
Wonderful.
We aren't through this pandemic yet, right, Elizabeth?
No, it's not done with us at all.
No. Well, I'm receiving many, many messages of thank you and great information coming through our chat box. We do have, let's take one more question. Could you talk about the difference between medical aid in dying and assisted suicide? Is there a difference, or the two phrases for the same thing?
They are two phrases for the same thing conceptually. A lot of us feel that suicide is too laden and the wrong word to be using with medical assistance in dying. And the argument for that, and there are some people who say it is suicide because you're doing something intentional to shorten life. Get over it, call it suicide. There are others of us who very strongly feel like suicide, medical aid in dying happens to, or people request, who would very much like to be alive, but they know they're dying. And so they're trying to control that process a bit and have some say in it. So it's not that they're suicidal. They would love to live, but they're trying in some way to have some control. So the older term is physician-assisted suicide. I personally find it unnecessarily pejorative and electric, but.
I see. Well, again, thank you so much, doctors. This has been a very thought-provoking, very informative lecture tonight, and it gets us all thinking and motivates us to do what we should do to prepare and talk to our people and prepare ourselves for the end of our life. So to all the guests out there, we have come to the end of our time for our lecture. A recording of tonight's lecture is available at bch.org, bch.org/live stream. You'll receive a post-lecture survey by email. Please take a moment to fill this out. And thank you again so very much, doctors, for your time and your expertise. And have a nice evening and good night.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Are we okay to chat? You did great, Elizabeth.
Oh no, I'm sorry about the technical issues, but
you did great.
I couldn't get the
Okay.
slides.